On my first summer back home from freshman year of college, I picked up a part-time job delivering pizza in a town around 30 minutes away from where I lived. The area in rural Georgia is known for having places that are in the middle of nowhere, and the pizza place's whole shtick was that it delivered to even the most remote areas imaginable within the town limits. I could fill books with the weird experiences from that summer. From the call that came from a long abandoned warehouse, to the dog that got excited about the pizza in my hand and accidentally shredded my pants with her claws. But there's one that will always stand out in my mind as the creepiest. It was getting fairly late at night, around 10:30 p.m., so I was confident at the time that I would be sent on no further calls before closing at 11. However, someone barely managed to miss the cutoff time, and our clerk accepted their order since they were so close. I was given the address and a single box of hot dough and sent on my merry little way. The first red flag was the driveway, or rather, the lack thereof. There was a mailbox, but no actual driveway, not even gravel. It was just grass and a barely distinguishable trodden pathway that resembled more of a service trail than it did something frequently used. I bumped along, wondering if I was even on the right route to the place, when I saw a slightly above average size house come over the horizon. Horribly dilapidated and completely surrounded by overgrown woods, I guesstimated where the rest of the driveway led and ended up parking in a grassy patch that could have been the walkway just as easily as it could have been the front yard. Headlights aimed towards the porch, as per company policy. I walked up to the door, but I believe that calling it a door is generous. It was a door frame alright, but the door itself was just a large slab of wood, propped haphazardly against the side of the house, barely covering the entrance. This was red flag number 2. The third and fourth red flag were also the door. This included the sheet of printer paper with the words, "Around back," scribbled in all caps, which was just hanging below the place where somebody had self-engraved the door with the title, Manson Family Ranch. Typically, I would never go around to the back of a house, especially a shady, unlit house, especially at night. However, it was my last drop of the day, and I was ready to get it over with and be on my way home. Against my better judgment, I went around to the back of the house. The back door here was an actual door, but it was covered in both cobwebs and fresh spider webs. Clearly, this was a door that had not been used in some time. I found the cleanest area available and knocked. I counted to 45 and knocked again. There were no lights on in the house, and I could hear no movement from inside. I knocked and counted again, and repeated the sequence 3 more times before I was finally creeped enough to decide to return to my car. As I turned, I finally heard a voice coming from inside the house, clearly agitated, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. I tried to knock 1 more time, and as I was counting, I heard something in the woods behind me. It started out as just movement deep in the trees, but soon enough, I could make out distinct running footsteps coming directly towards me through the bush. As I'm standing there, coming to terms with my impending demise, I follow the direction of the noise to the edge of the woods, which is around 15 feet away from me. In the moonlight, I could clearly see the woman who stepped out. She was relatively old, maybe in her 60s, I would guess. She had long blonde gray hair, which was tangled and matted, and hung down past her hips. She was in what looked to be originally a white nightgown, but at that time, it was dingy and closer to a beige-brown color. She was absolutely barefoot, and her feet were covered in dirt, and what had to be blood, presumably due to the fact that she had just sprinted through the prickly woods, where there was no trail to be seen. I never learned her name, but I still affectionately referred to her as Red Flag Number 5. She stopped short when she saw me and started to shake her head No, with her eyes wide. I stood there, like a terrified deer at the most fucked up headlights ever, as she took a few more steps towards me, reaching out to me, with her finger pointed. Her voice came out way stronger than mine would have at the time when she spoke. You know how southern people can either sound like loving grandmothers or backwoods murderers? Well, she sounded in between. When she drawled, "Oh, no, 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 no. Honey, no. You get on out of here." I wish I could say I listened. I ran, I left, but I was so in shock at how events were playing out that my own self-preservation was put on a back burner while I tried to figure out what in the fuck was happening. She seemed to realize that I was not moving, even if I could not make my mouth move to ask her what was happening, or even what to do with the stupid pizza in my hands. She looked at me like she could have smacked the hell out of me right then and there, and proceeded to deliver red flags 6 through 12. Darling, did you hear me? You deaf or dumb? Young girls like you come out here, and they don't get to leave. I finally realized this was not a little ghost story. This was 5'3", 116-pound me, potentially being targeted to be robbed, or kidnapped, or worse. So I dropped the dumb little pizza, and started running back to my car, which I had stupidly left unlocked, as was usual for most of my deliveries. As I neared the car, I heard a slam from behind me, and I looked over my shoulder to see that the wooden door had been pushed over and had fallen into the porch beneath it. As I was closing the car door, an older man was limping down the front steps, waving his arms at me, calling me a little bitch, telling me, "Get out of the fucking car, now." At a loss for what to do, I called out something muttery and shaky, and along the lines of, "Your pizza's out back." I floored my dad's terrible little 90s Lexus, and somehow managed to avoid trees on the odd trail back to the main road, which was still 12 miles, and several turns from any road that actually had a name, let alone painted lines. I reported it to my manager, and he said he contacted the police, but nothing ever came of it that I'm aware of. Either way, that was my first, and hopefully last, personal encounter with the self-proclaimed Manson family ranch. I'm a 22-year-old woman. I used to do DoorDash on the side for some extra cash. This was in the summer of 2018, when it was a little bit newer, at least in my town it was. Since then, I think they've made a lot of changes, but at the time, it was a little unorganized. If you don't know what DoorDash is, it's like a food delivery service typically for restaurants that don't deliver. Anyways, I decided to do my last delivery around 10 p.m. So I get an order in, and the person wants a medium cheese and pepperoni pizza and loaded potato wedges from a pizzeria nearby. I was kind of wondering why they'd order from a pizzeria that delivers, but I figured it's because this place was notorious for taking forever when you order for delivery. I accepted the order and headed to the pizzeria. I got there and picked up the pizza, confirmed on the app that I had picked everything up, and was on my way. The app notified me of the special instructions that the customer asked for, which was to call them when I was outside. Okay, nothing unusual there. Lots of people ask that so they can come out to me. I get to their address, and it's downtown. It's a larger apartment building, and it's completely pitch black, and I instantly get an eerie feeling. So I pull up to the curb. I stay in the car and call the number. Luckily, DoorDash has this thing that hides your actual phone number. It rings a couple times, and then this really creepy woman's voice comes on the line and says, "We can't get to the phone right now. We're a little tied up," and then creepily giggles. Meanwhile, the entire time in the background, there's another woman screaming, and I mean screaming for help and for her life. It got even louder, as if the creepy woman was purposely putting the screaming woman on the phone. I instantly hung up and drove away real quick, not even knowing which direction to go. Luckily, there was a super popular restaurant a couple blocks away, and I pulled into that parking lot and then pulled up the app. I was worried about getting in trouble for not being able to deliver the order, so I contacted DoorDash Help Center, and they told me I had to wait 15 minutes to see if they'd call me or message me about their food. Well, they never called, and thank God for that. I'm sitting there in the parking lot of the restaurant, telling my mom about it, and we agreed that it is probably a prank, but that just in case it isn't, I need to call the police. So I called the non-emergency number and tell them everything. The police tell me they're going to do a wellness check, and actually thanked me for calling them to tell them about it. I went home and nothing ever came about it. I still think about it from time to time. I did get a free pizza and potato wedges though, so that was cool. When I was 20 years old, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired, due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an asshole, and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of the shift went by without any issues, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it in on my GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm waiting there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down, but thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine, sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money, I hand him the pizza, and as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and can't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks me what my name is, being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking straight. I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asked if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is, I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay. I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and stands at the doorway staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers, and they agreed it was pretty creepy. Except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, we get an order from the same guy again. And this is when shit finally hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and walk to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man. Except this time, he was wearing a suit, and I jumped back. He laughs and said, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window. I figured I'd just open the door now. That way you don't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house, so he was sitting in the dark this whole time. And if so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" I once again tell him I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side and grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially bricks at this point and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading to him, "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I've seen on someone's face and says, "I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into the house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that to this day, I am still thankful worked as he was doing that. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosened his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and tries pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and even yells, "Why are you making this so f***ing difficult?" I grab a half-empty soda bottle that I had in the cup holder and throw it, and luckily, it hits his head and he lets me go. I slam the door, and then all of a sudden, he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot and quickly reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the f***ing car." I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick guy as I could. In my panicked state, I drove a couple blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared I was being followed. Eventually, I reached a red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there, crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front to wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed, and strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later, I receive an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sexual crimes. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for doing sexual things with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted they would find him, and indeed they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently, he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager, walking alone late night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time. They called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they did, and for informing me. I walked out of the station, I walked down the street, and I light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house.